In this week's video, what we're going to go over is how I went from this to this. Oh, and stick around till the end, because at the end, I'll give you a quick sneak peek of the different areas of the workshop, and I'll show you what I'm intending on doing within the space. Bits I can show you. I've learned some lessons along the way as well, and we're going to get to those as and when I show you the footage for them, because there was quite a few, as there has been with the rest of the build. But if you're in a situation like this and you've got your workshop built and you're thinking about what you're going to do with the interior, there's a couple of decisions you have to make before you start throwing the cladding into the walls and getting it all insulated. First of all, electrics. Far better to get that done in a first fix, as I found out, than trying to retrofit and add plugs here and there and wire them through. It's going to look messy if you do that after you've done the insulation. So before I started insulating, I got my electrician around and asked him to put in wires so that then I could clad around them. But if you were like me and you've got a workshop and you've got no idea where anything's going to live, how do you know where to put the wires? How do you know how many sockets you need? And so forth. Just ask for more. This is the tool wall. This has got 3 double sockets at floor height. By floor height, I mean 1.5 foot off the ground. Back wall, 2 double sockets just behind me. The front wall has got a double socket down on the one side and a single socket on the other side. And that's where the fuse box and the kill switch is that will kill all the electrics as I leave the building. That's important for me. You guys might not need that, but for me, to have the peace of mind that I shut everything off with one switch, that was quite important. Then, along the window side, another 3 double sockets, and this is something that you guys probably won't need to consider, but I have lights for filming, so I've put 4 single sockets up at ceiling height. They might come in handy for other stuff like dust extraction, you never know. I've put in 6 spots for everyday use. Then I had a choice. I'm going to have one big workbench right in the middle of this room. Long story short, I got 2 double sockets right in the middle of the room, right in the ceiling. So with all of those wires in place and the electrician happy that I can then start putting in insulation, you've got your next decision. And that next decision is, what is it you're insulating against? For me, it's more than just hot and cold, extreme temperatures. For me, I also have to think about noise pollution. That I decided that the entire cavity of the wall should be packed full of rock wool. That does lead to one minor issue that I had to get past. And that is, if you imagine a sound wave hits a piece of plywood, and behind that you've got your 2x4 uprights from the stud work. Behind that you've got another sheet of OSB, and behind that you've got your cladding. There's nothing to stop the wave really travelling very efficiently through that and outside. So I decided to get some of this thick acoustic foam tape and tape it on every single one of the rafters, every single bit of stud work, so that where those plywood sheets hit it, there was that gap of soundproofing insulation before it got to the main bit of the stud work. If you're doing it on the roof and leaving it overnight, press it down really well, because you'll come out the next morning and it'll all be dangling everywhere, because it's not as sticky as you think it is. One build that you saw in one of the previous videos was the doors. Now the doors in that video I left hollow and didn't even have a backer board on them. And a lot of people rightfully pointed out that the angles that I'd put on them to hold them square were nowhere near strong enough for what I'd made. And you were right. But I was always planning on insulating them. And by that, I just put some very thin foam sheets across on the back of the door, just glued them in with some hot glue, and then left an air gap. And then after the air gap, I just put a sheet of foil-lined polystyrene and then sealed it up with tape. And then for extra strength, and so it matches the inside and I can hang stuff off it, I just used 12mm ply to finish the door off, and that will hold it sturdy for as long as it stands. So, decision time with the walls, and we went with rock wool. It's better for acoustic, probably slightly worse for the temperature shifts, and definitely more messy. I've got a recess left by the stud work, which is approximately 95mm. So I got myself some 100mm rock wool and I just shoved it into the gaps. You can be a little bit rough with this stuff. If you cut it 10mm, 20mm wider than the gap you need, it's still going to go in. One little bit of advice here. It has 2 sides. One side tends to be a little bit more stable than the other side. I would always have that side on the outside facing you, or the inside as it were, so that there's less mess and less fluffy stuff to tuck in and less likelihood of it falling out. The ceiling is going to be done slightly differently because, well, I'll talk to you about the ceiling in a minute. One thing to be a little bit careful of when you're dealing with rock wool is, first of all, how you cut it. You can be quite rough with it, but if you can get the sharper and a longer bladed knife and cut through it cleaner, you're going to have less mess getting it in. But more importantly, wear a dust mask and cover your arms, because those are areas that I didn't even think about until about 5 minutes into the job. And then I realized, oh, eye protection. It will go in your eyes. And again, that's something that you're going to see in the ceiling build, because clearly it's not going to get in my eyes too much from the walls, but it does later. And while you're being a bit rough with it and you're cutting it, don't worry if you stuff smaller pieces in to make up a larger void, because it tends to squish together quite nicely and fill itself. Don't try and get this perfectly neat. It's going to be easier on yourself if you can use all of the offcuts that you've got left over to fill up some of the smaller voids. That's what I did. Now, I've moved you way back to the other side of the workshop here. I say way back, compared to the little shed, it is acres of space I've got. It's not that big. But what I wanted to show you was something I should have done from the very start that I didn't. I should have cleared all of this space that I'm in now well before I started putting the insulation in. Because between me and you, it is an absolute nightmare if you're going to try and put insulation in the ceiling and you haven't cleared the space in the middle. Watch the next bits, you'll see. Now, the ceiling is another area you've got some decisions to make. And if you're planning a build like this, I would start those decisions right at the stage that you're deciding what roof you're going to put on the building and what your building constraints are for the height. As I'm not an expert in this, I'm going to very briefly tell you what my understanding of each one is and why I didn't go for it very quickly on the hot roof. A hot roof, you would have your rafters, then on top of the rafters an OSB sheet, then a thick sheet of insulation, then an OSB sheet, and then your roofing material, whether it's felt or, in my case, rubber. Now, I'm going to have those rafters regardless, and if I start piling stuff on top, I'm probably going to lose the best part of another 10 mil on top, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you've only got 2.5 meters as your maximum workable height and a slanting ceiling down to 2.4 meters, if you take another 10 centimeters out, looking here, the height would be not far off head height. The positives of the hot roof, sadly, are that it is much easier to stop any mold and mildew building up above whatever your ceiling material is, because you have a big air gap that you can get a lot of airflow through. With a cold roof, instead of having everything above the rafters, all you have is a sheet of OSB and then your rubber roof. So you've saved yourself all of that depth in insulation. But you have to pack your insulation in the depth of the rafters, which in my case is probably about 140 mil of workable space that I've got. And you have to fit an air gap in. The way I really wanted to go was to get 30 mil foil lined insulation up on the top, right underneath the OSB sheet under the roof, because I figured that would deal directly with the sun coming down and the cold coming in as well. And then I wanted an air gap, and under that to have 75 mil rock wool. I went for a little bit thinner than the walls because I was worried about using up too much of the space. But the problem with this is keeping that air gap and not having all of your rock wool fall out while you're getting your sheets up to hold it in place sounded like it was going to be a real pain. So I flipped it. And this is no recommendation. This is just the way that I decided to do it, because I figure I've still got all of those different stages in and I still keep my air gap. But instead of it being between the two layers, it's at the bottom. So what I've done is I've packed the rock wool right up against the roof. And then I've held it into place with the foil lined polystyrene boards. So I can work to my own speed now because they're nice and snug and fully taped around the seams, so they're not coming out. What was left underneath that is approximately a 30 mil gap, which is going to be my airflow. Directly under that is a thick sheet of plastic to work as your non-breathable membrane, and then locking it all in, plywood sheets. So technically you've got your air gap between the plastic sheet and the foil lined insulation, and that air gap goes all the way. I had to drill some holes through the sides so that the soffits and the airflow that's coming up under the cladding will bring that airflow round and will take away any chance of damp and mildew, touch wood. And equally what you're also doing with that full sheet of polythene, of plastic, is you're stopping all of the moisture that is created within the room from breathing, from hot air. You're stopping that getting through to hit the cold air from the roof and causing condensation. And there's the bit getting in your eye. When you're working on that ceiling, try and work slightly to the side or have full wraparound goggles so that you don't have any chance of these bits getting in your eyes, because it's really nasty. If you've never worked with foil lined insulation before, there's two ways of cutting it. You can either freehand it and it gets a wavy line all over the place and that affects the next piece you're cutting off, or you can actually take your time, lay it on the ground or a flat surface, use a spirit level, cut a straight line, and from there you'll see your job gets a lot easier. With the rock wool, it's a little bit more forgiving. To anybody that's done this before, this is going to sound like a really silly suggestion, but every time I do a job, this seems to come in handy every time. Now this is a multi-tool that is used by decorators. In the tight to reach spaces that need a lot of rock wool stuffing into them, you can do it with your hands. But was there a time when you did the cladding where you're not quite sure if a screw went through into the stud work? Grab yourself one of these. Save your fingers, because I guarantee if you missed with one of those screws, it's probably going to be the place that you don't use this and you'll find it. I'll pop a link to it in the description, because if you haven't got one, you might find a lot of uses for it. With all that in place, the next thing is to put the polythene sheet up. The best bit of advice I saw was to start in the ceiling, overlap where you need to, and tape up the joints. Give yourself some space in the corners so that it doesn't bunch out, so it sits snug into the corner, because otherwise when you put the sheets on, they're not going to sit into the corner nicely. And roll it out on the floor, add about 30mm extra on either side so that when you drape it down on the side walls, you can then overlap it with what you're going to put on the walls. All you need is a stapler, and take it one rafter at a time when you're going along the roof. I started by stapling it all to the one wall and then running out one rafter and then running out another and running out another and pulling it as tight as I felt I needed to between each one. Remember, you're going to put ply sheeting underneath this, so if it's a little bit saggy in places, it's not going to be a major problem. And then do the walls the same way. Remember to cut out your outlets or your sockets, because you're going to need to do that anyway at some stage, so now's as good a time as any. And then trim it off at floor height once you've got it all stapled in. I don't know if it's the right stuff, but I use the same tuck tape that I use for the breathable membrane on the outside. Super sticky. Quite handy tip here is to have one gloved hand on one loose hand. The loose hand to get it started, and the gloved hand to flatten it. I found if I use my bare hands, you've got a lot of glue residue on them, and that's really annoying, basically. So now, once you've created what looks like a murder room, for want of a better description, the next thing is to cover it all with ply. You could go with the plasterboard, you could OSB sheet it, choose depending on what use you're going to have. For me, I went with 12mm or 1/2 inch ply on the walls, and then 5mm, 1/4 inch ply, 6mm give or take on the ceiling. This was a tough decision, and for a long time I thought I'd made a huge mistake. The reason I chose it, 12mm on the walls so it's sturdy enough to have things hung up on, and the ceiling, I went for lighter because it's me working on my own. I made these great T-stands that were supposed to help me, and they didn't, not really much. And I would say if you've got rafters that are further apart than mine, which are about 400mm on centre, you're probably going to get a wavy finish. I did on the edges, and I was really worried where board met board. I had a lot of waves on it, because as you move your way along the rafters, screwing it in, if you haven't got it perfectly tight, it does start to move around. And also, where that rubber stripping is underneath it, it does tend to bend in a little bit more under the screws. But don't worry, I did have a solution for it. I don't have a perfect size where I can do full board sheets without the need for cutting. And I didn't want to on the ceiling, particularly, which is where I was starting, I didn't want to have it running right down the middle of the join, because then I've got to cut every board. So I just started doing full sheets along the one side and decided to have my join 2/3 of the way across the room and follow that down on the walls. And I followed every join down and made sure that they were aligned, because then when I put my battens on, which I guess I can give away my solution to the joins, it's battening, then they will join up and I'll get nice crisp lines going down the sides as well as along the ceiling. Cutting the boards, it's the same thing you've seen me do 100 times with the ply during this project with the OSB. It's just my circular saw and a straight edge. With this, the better you can get it, the straighter you can get it, the better finish you're going to get. I plan on putting some beading around the edges and the corners and where everything meets itself. So I didn't put too much pressure on myself to get it absolutely spot on, but the closer the better. Whether your sockets are on the ceiling or on the walls, as I've had to do later, measuring them carefully, measuring them twice, is going to get you the best results. I was a little bit silly on this one, very much so. I didn't realise quite how tight I had to cut them so that the front of the socket would actually cover the hole. And I left quite a mess on all of them. And my jigsaw broke, so I had to use a reciprocating saw to cut the holes, which isn't made for intricate work. I'll show you the results at the end. And I'll also give you an idea of how I'm going to fix it, because it does need fixing. But if there is ever a time to ask for help, the ceiling is the time, because holding the wood up at two ends, especially when it's as floppy as this 5mm ply, and getting the screws in and getting it all as tight as you can get it, is definitely a two-man job. I even thought I was being really clever with the sockets, and I made myself a little template. And even the template is the wrong size, way too big. As with everything that I've done, ceiling, walls, OSB sheeting on the outside, you can use 40mm, 50mm screws. And to be honest, I didn't worry too much about countersinking these. I just let them drive in as far as they would, and I'll go over with some filler at the end. Once all the boards were done, it was about putting this battening in to cover up all of the mistakes I've made. Now, if you've got a table saw, you can run these off really quickly. I only have the circular saw, but what I do have is this handy accessory. It's so simple and it comes with it, but if you're cutting strips of anything of a certain width and you want it to be uniform and quick, this isn't the 100% method, but this is the 95% method, and it's so much easier than having to keep clamping on a board as your straight edge. If you don't have a track saw, if you don't have a table saw, this in a pinch will get the job done nice and quick. I've used the 5mm on the walls because it's not doing anything structural. So I've just used it as a nice pattern effect, because then it carries on the battens from the ceiling. On the ceiling, I've gone with 12mm, something a little bit thicker, and I've screwed it in. This is just nailed and glued. I've screwed it in up there because where the two boards met and there's the ripple, this straightens it. So this actually holds it snug to the rafters and straightens it all out, and it looks so much better. Once all the strips are up, then it's just a case of every single screw you've put in, put some putty on it or some filler, whatever you're going to use. I wish I'd used less screws, because then you've got to sand it. And depending on how passionate you are on the finish, I cared more about this wall than any of the other ones, because you're going to see this one more. It's a lot of work, and especially on the ceiling as well, over your head. So decide what finish you're going to go for. If it's a workshop and you're not going to be filming in it, you don't have to worry too much about what it's going to look like. So you might just want to leave the screws exposed. Certainly helps if you're going to replace a panel if it gets beaten up down the road. To make the edges of the battening a little bit crisper, get some decorator's cork. Smooth it into the corner, let it dry before you paint, and it gets a much crisper finish and makes it look like these are really part of that wall. Now, I feel a little bit silly telling you this, and I'm not proud of it. I thought that decorator's cork on the back wall, I thought it would be sandable. There was a moment I realised that it's not. Get it smooth on the first application, let it dry because it has a stretch. It's much more like silicone. It doesn't sand. Not very well. And do a little bit of a better job of lining up the different strips on the ceiling. I didn't get one that would go the full length because it's longer than a sheet of ply. And if you don't, at certain angles, you're going to see that they're not quite lined up. Again, you could walk into this workshop 100 times. Chances are you're not going to see it unless I show you. And I'm not going to show you. Not again anyway. So there you have it. I know some of you are going to have questions. Floor. If you look back on the first video, or don't look back, but if you remember the first video, I put foil insulation in the entirety of the base and I taped it off. Where I've put all of that plastic sheeting around to stop any moisture getting into the walls and the ceiling, that equally stops anything coming up through the floor as well. I do want to put a second floor down. I want to put the thin insulation that I used at the back of the doors. I want to cover the floor with that and put another layer of 12mm OSB on top, or ply. The reason for that is, since I've been in here and I've been using it, the floor is getting roughed up really quickly, and I'm conscious that is the permanent floor. And I don't want to be cutting pieces out of it if it gets damaged. The mess of the sockets, I'll show you. And my plan to fix it is using my laser. You'll see that on the laser video, the next one coming up, because it's going to be much more useful things for a workshop. French cleats, laser fixes for idiots with reciprocating saws trying to cut sockets out, things like that. I promise you, I'm going to do the full pricing for this entire workshop. Spoiler alert, it's gone slightly over budget. Let me just give you a quick idea of what I plan to do with the layout of this place, because I think that's quite interesting. I've completely flipped the camera around so you can see from the front to the back. This is the start of the making of my French cleat wall. I don't feel I'm giving away too much of the video here because you've seen all of this when it was in the old shed. So, what that video is going to entail though is more holders for different types of tools. Something a little bit fancier, something a little bit more useful, something that I think is going to be better for this space. But that's this wall. Can't show you any more. I've covered 2 windows up with acoustic panels so that hopefully the sound isn't going to echo around here quite as much. I need to put some on the ceilings, but that's going to be after the final electrics finish is done. If I move you right to where the doors are, you can see I've cleared a huge amount of space in the middle I showed you earlier. Well, the next build that I'm going to be taking on, or the next big build, is going to be a full-size workbench. And it's going to have a table saw sunk into it, a job site saw, which I'm about to order. It's also going to hopefully have built-in dust extraction. It's going to have dog holes on one side. It's going to have a hand tool area in it. It's going to be an everything bench, all in one. So, as we close to the end of this workshop build, I'm going to reiterate what I've said in all of these videos. I'm not an expert. I hope that this all helps to inspire people to realize what they can do with limited skills and a lot of hard work. And if you've got any questions, reach out to me in the comments. If by any chance you've not seen any of this build, it's all in a playlist here. If I've already done the budget video, that's up there. If it's not done yet, I'll put something there that I think you'll enjoy. Thank you so much for being patient with this one and watching it. See you over there.